Okay. In this video, I want to address what Alan Watts was saying so many times over. He uses the term wiggly, and he says that everything in reality is really just wiggly. Wiggly wiggles, wiggling about. And he even goes so far as to say, and this is, I think, the most poignant thing that really, really, really gets at the core of what Alan Watts's view was. And I can't go further than that because I don't know enough about Buddhism to project that into the entire religion of Buddhism. But it was certainly Alan Watts's view. And he was very intelligent, but he had this idea that everything in reality was just wiggly, that it was amorphous in some way. And then if you really pay attention to what he's saying and you really critically think about it, you'll realize that what he's saying eventually points to something he explicitly said in one of his lectures, that everything is nothing. Everything is ultimately just bits of nothing. Now, he's close. That's part of it, but it's not all of it, because if everything really were nothing, then we wouldn't be able to say it. There wouldn't be anything to say. Now, you could say that there's nothing absolute that we could say about anything, unless we use absolute terms like nothing, everything, and indiscernibility, or limits in between everything and nothing, which is the wiggliness that he's talking about. So his philosophy was undeveloped, but there was parts of it that really did resound and really did ring true. There is a wiggliness to everything. There is an edge to everything. Everything has its limits. Even God has his limits. However, those limits are wiggly. Those limits they're not amorphous, but they are fuzzy, messy, fractal, very, very complex. And actually, if you stare at anything long enough, or if you critically think about anything long enough, you'll eventually be able to reduce everything into limits. And you'll see that everything is actually just made out of limits. And so then you can start to expand what Alan Watts was saying about everything being nothing ultimately, just little bits of nothing. Well, okay, let's take that view and say that everything is a bunch of nothings, plural. Okay, so the plurality of these bits of nothing, or locations in nothing, would be qualitatively identical, which I think is what he was really getting at, but relativistically, proximally distinct, which I think he missed. There is a natural displacement, a repulsion, an exclusion of things that he never talked about. He always wanted to talk about inclusion and how everything is all one and all of that stuff, and that's fine. There is a view, that you can take that does reduce everything into one unit, everything, or reality, or the cosmos, whatever you want to call it, the world. I call it reality or creation. And depending on if I'm feeling religious about it or not. So, in creation, or in the world, in reality, there are three absolutes. There is nothing. And you could say that there are bits of nothing if those bits are bounded or limited in some way. And those limits would be fuzzy, but they would be limits. And they would say, this part is over here and that part is over there, and they are not the same part. And the distinction between them, while relative to each other, if I relate all of them to each other, and the trick is to have all of them in one arrangement, then I can say that there's a grid. There's a map where all of these bits of nothing fit. And they all fit in their own areas. And they don't overlap, and they don't stack, and they don't absorb or disintegrate. They remain static and the same, fixed in their locations. And then things pass through them, like, for example, those limits. Where are those limits in relation to the nothing? Their limits are going to be voluminous. They're going to fill the volume of what was once nothing into an infinite number of limits that describe every single location of every single thing. Because there's a center to everything. Whatever it is, this bit of nothing that you might visualize in your head, there's a center to that, and there's a center to that, and there's a center to that, and it can actually zoom in fractally infinitely, because there's a center to everything. Even centers have centers. And so we have a center of nothing. Everything has a center. And then immediately adjacent to that center, there is the volume, which is the limit that describes where that nothing ends and where something else begins. And so we could say one part or bit of nothing ends at some location because it can't overlap it, because there's another bit of nothing over there, right, adjacent to it. And in between these two adjacent bits of nothing, there must then be a limit which describes one location on one side and another location on the other side of that limit, like a fence that tells you where your neighbor's house and property ends and yours begins. So, like I said, given that every possible thing that you could ever imagine being existent has that limit, so then there must be nothing but those limits. Now, granted, there's these bits of nothing, but they're bounded with limits because there's a multiplicity of them, which means if there's more than one, there must be a space between them. And that space cannot be a bit of nothing because it's dividing two bits of nothing. So it itself cannot be yet another bit of nothing. So you have this line, this limit that forms between them. And that pervades throughout the volume. And then at the edge of all of those, as they all combine into one giant blob of limits, the edge of that blob, the periphery, is everything. That's the totality, that's being itself. And so that's what he's getting at when he's trying to describe what things are. They are that. They are a center of nothing, and then there's an infinite volume of limits. And then at the edge of that, there's a periphery, which describes the totality as one individual being. So that every being is, like he said, a multitude of individuals, and those individuals have nothing at their core, at the center, at the very, 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 very center. And through that nothing, there's a holographic projection, and that is the self. That's the holographic illusion of the self. And it's, I guess, what you would call an ego. The ego is observing reality through that nothing and seeing lights all around it. And it forms this voluminous map of limits. This part's over here and that part's over there. And it's a conceptual overlay of everything that is outside of itself. And it's displayed microcosmically in that voluminous space of all those limits. And this is our image or experience of the world. It's not the world, but it's similar to it. It's our experience of the world. It's that particular location's view of every other bit of existence. And so each of us has our own unique location, and then each of us has our own unique view. And all of those views have limits in between them, and if you were to add all of those views up, then you would get the God's eye view of creation, or at least you'd get creation's view of itself. And then if you go beyond that, then you would get to God's view. So it's impossible to ever even conjecture as to what that might be, what God's view is, because we'll never be able to complete the totality of creation conceptually in our minds to follow every single possible position simultaneously. We could do one bit at a time, and we could do many of them strategically placed so that we could have a large map and approximate it, and then fill in the gaps with our own intuitive guess. And that's the experience of living, of being as a verb.